top box office draw in the world, and the movie industry was ruled by the big studios, which were churning out films in greater quantities than ever. To keep churning out movies, the studios would assign different writers to work on the same script, all of them competing for that most important measure of success, a screen credit. Scott joined that assembly line when he was asked to rewrite A Yank at Oxford, a comedy about an American Rhodes Scholar and his adventures in England.
Well, I'm restraining myself as best I can.
Oh, you wicked.
But like so many films Fitzgerald would work on, the script went through endless revisions, and he did not end up with a screen credit. On first arriving in Hollywood, Scott made an effort to curb his drinking. When he did attend parties, he would sit quietly in a corner drinking soda. That's where Sheila Graham, a young Hollywood gossip columnist, first saw him.
My mother saw this ghostly-looking man. He was absolutely pale. He was sitting under a lamp, smoking a cigarette, and he was the palest shade of white she had ever seen, but rather fascinating looking. There was something about this man that really struck her imagination.
Scott was also quite taken with Sheila, who had beautiful green eyes and a lovely smile. He asked her out on a date, and though Scott was an older, married man, she couldn't resist his charm.
Women loved him. He was a very, very charming man to women, but men didn't like him, actually. I mean, he was not a man's man in the way, like, you think of Ernest Hemingway. He was not a man of business, he was not a man of the world in that kind of sense, but women found him very charming.
Scott and Sheila became a steady couple. However, Fitzgerald was frank about the arrangement. He was a married man and had no plans of divorcing Zelda.
The fact that he was having an affair with Sheila was another part of his life, but had nothing to do with his loyalty and devotion to Zelda. They had a communication that was rare among couples.
Of his love for Zelda, Scott wrote, "It was one in a century. Life ended for me when Zelda and I crashed. If she would get well, I would be happy again and my soul would be released." But Zelda, now in a hospital in North Carolina, showed no signs of getting better. When her old friends Sarah and Honoria Murphy stopped in for a visit, they found her in a sad state.
She had a very severe haircut, and she had a black suit and a white blouse, and she had to make conversation. And it was so sad to see my mother and her making conversation. My mother would say, "Do you remember the Hemingways?" And, "Oh, I think I do. He was very nice," or something. She didn't really remember them. And she was just out of it. It was very sad to see.
In the fall of 1937, Fitzgerald was assigned to work on a film called Three Comrades. The movie was about three German officers who compete for the love of one woman.
Three comrades. To what?
Upon its release, Three Comrades was hailed as one of the best films of 1938. But Fitzgerald hated it. He felt his script had been ruined by Joseph Mankiewicz, the film's producer, who rewrote much of the dialogue. In a now famous letter, Fitzgerald protested the changes. "For 19 years, I've written best-selling entertainment, and my dialogue is supposedly right up at the top. But I learned from the script that you've suddenly decided it isn't good." "Oh, Joe, can't producers ever be wrong? I'm a good writer. Honest." Three Comrades was the first and last time Fitzgerald got a screen credit. In December 1938, MGM did not renew his contract, and he had to scramble for freelance work. At one point, he was brought in to polish the dialogue of Gone with the Wind, but David Selznick replaced him after just 2 weeks. As he grew more frustrated, Fitzgerald began to revert to his old pattern of drinking gin all day. Sheila Graham, who did not drink, was appalled by his drunken behavior.
My mother often described him as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You know, one minute here was this charming man, quite fastidious about his appearance. As soon as he started drinking, there'd be a total change in personality.
Scott, please, please.
Scott's drinking led to some terrible fights with Sheila.
whenever I want.
Fights that were depicted in a movie based on Sheila's autobiography starring Gregory Peck and Deborah Carr.
They wrestled over a loaded gun, screaming at each other, horrible things. Finally, she just had enough. She actually threw the gun across the room and said rather dramatically,
"I didn't drag myself up from the gutter to waste myself on a worthless junk like you. Worthless! Worthless! I hate you!"
Fitzgerald was always so remorseful after these fights that Sheila forgave him. But he was getting a bad reputation in Hollywood. By 1939, he was lucky to get a job collaborating on a script with Bud Schulberg, a young writer who was thrilled to be working with one of his idols.
I was enormously in awe of him. I couldn't imagine that I'd be in the same room with Scott Fitzgerald, much less being paired with him as a fellow writer. And I looked at him, and my first impression of him was almost ghostly. Everything about him looked pale and faded. He seemed old, seemed tired, really.
Scott and Bud had been hired to write a film about Dartmouth College's annual winter carnival. On a fact-finding trip to the school, Schulberg was asked by the movie's director to watch Scott and make sure he didn't drink.
We got on the winter carnival special. I thought I was watching him, but by this time Scott was really getting seriously smashed. And he had with him a little bottle of gin. I don't know where he found it. When I was with him, I thought we were practically in bed together. I don't know where he found that damn gin.
Eventually, Schulberg gave up and joined Scott on his binge. The film's director arrived to find his two writers weaving their way through campus.
We were like two drunken, falling down bums. And he said, "I don't know what the next train out of here is, but you two are going to be on it."
After getting fired, no one wanted to hire Fitzgerald. So in the fall of 1939, he went back to writing novels. Drawing on his latest experiences in Hollywood, he began a book called The Last Tycoon. And though alcoholism had begun to take its toll on Scott's health, he was excited about his new project.
You read his letters to Zelda and to Scotty, telling them how he's taken up with this book, how it's like the old days again, how every day he looks forward to sitting down and working on The Last Tycoon. It breaks your heart to realize that this man only has a few more months to live.
By October 1939, Fitzgerald was deeply engrossed in writing The Last Tycoon. After his experience in Hollywood, he was happy to be writing novels again. But at 44, Scott was not in good health. For years, he had been abusing his body. And in November, he suffered a mild heart attack that frightened him so much he stopped drinking altogether. From that point on, Scott seemed almost in a race to finish his novel. December 21st, 1940. Scott and Sheila Graham were enjoying a quiet afternoon together, listening to classical music.
He suddenly stood up from the chair and grabbed the mantelpiece and collapsed on the floor. And my mother just rushed to him and thought that he had fainted.
But the problem was far more serious. Scott had suffered a massive heart attack.
The door was open, and there he was sprawled on the floor. I didn't know what happened. Thought he had fainted, moved closer, and realized he was dead, and it was an absolute shock.
F. Scott Fitzgerald, the man who came to symbolize the Jazz Age with its celebration of youth, was dead at the very young age of 44. His death came as a terrible blow to his friends and family.
Zelda called because she wanted to talk to somebody who had been there so that she could believe that he was dead. And that was terribly sad.
December 27th, 1940. F. Scott Fitzgerald was buried in Union Cemetery in Rockville, Maryland, where his father's family had lived. Few people came to his funeral, not even Zelda, who was too ill to travel. She would spend the next 8 years in